Hello and welcome to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. The subject of today's episode once famously remarked in 1990, 5 years ago, the British were having elections and the Soviets had internal party coups. Now, the British have internal party coups and the Soviets are having the elections. Mikhail Gorbachev's remarks on the downfall of Margaret Thatcher seem more prescient than ever this week after the defenestration of Liz Truss, surely the most lacklustre Prime Minister in our history. I've yet to cover any single person who has exerted a bigger effect on the world we live in today than Mikhail Gorbachev. When he died in August this year, the outpouring of grief for the 91-year-old in the West was immense. He was heralded as the man who ended the Cold War, and, through his signing of a 1987 nuclear treaty with Ronald Reagan, as the man who brought the world back from the brink of total destruction. However, Gorbachev's legacy would lead you to the conclusion that the greater an impact a person leaves on the world, the less the world agrees on what exactly it is they left behind. Because for all the praise Gorbachev garnered in the West, those who lead Russia today see a very different legacy. Gorbachev wasn't just the last leader of the Soviet Union, he was the last leader of an economic and military superpower. When the Soviet Union fell, Russia, the heart of that empire, lost 25% of its territory in 3 years. The 1990s was horrendous for ordinary Russians, with GDP per capita in the country more than halving across the decade. The degree to which this economic emasculation can be blamed on Gorbachev, who left power in 1991, is debatable, but there's little doubting he lit the fuse under the disintegration of the Soviet Empire. Fast forward 30 years to the present, and democracy in Russia is dead, and an orthodox Christian nationalist regime is waging the worst war in Europe since 1945. The doomsday clock, which indicates how close the world is to nuclear war, is now closer to midnight, i.e. total destruction, than at any time during the Cold War. Gorbachev's legacy, in other words, is complicated, but you can't overlook him if you want to understand the mess we're in today. The person I've chosen to talk about Gorbachev is someone who has spent his adult life looking at Russia and watching the slow-motion disintegration of the Soviet Union. In the 1990s, John Lough worked as a NATO representative in Moscow and worked as an international advisor to Russian oil company TNK BP from 2003 until 2008. He is now an associate fellow of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House and the senior vice president at global risk advisory firm Highgate. As well as Gorbachev's career, we discussed the air of inevitability surrounding the Soviet Union's collapse, the emergence of right-wing nationalism in Russia, and whether the so-called unipolar moment, the period after the Cold War where the United States seemed completely untouchable, was really a good thing for its foreign policy. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Mikhail Gorbachev. Hi John, how are you?
Hi.
John, we're talking about Mikhail Gorbachev today. He was the last leader of the Soviet Union. When he died at the end of August this year, a Russian TV ad that he appeared in 1998 for Pizza Hut did the rounds on social media. I just want to read some of the script for that. Because of him, that's Gorbachev, we have opportunity, says one person. And then another person says, no, because of him we have instability. Because of him we have freedom, complete chaos, hope. And it ends, because of him we have Pizza Hut. That, I think, sets up the idea that Gorbachev meant many different things to different people. What does he mean to you, John?
For me, he stands as a deeply contradictory figure who had massive influence over global affairs at the time. There's no question that his decisions and his actions brought the Cold War to an end, and with it the Soviet Union. And that fundamentally changed the shape of Europe. And it did create really an unprecedented opportunity for Europe to unite at the end of the Cold War. But of course, that vision turned out to be excessively optimistic, and a Russia emerged with which I think Gorbachev was personally very uncomfortable. He was a contradictory figure for me in the sense that he embarked on a set of policies when he came to power in 1985 which were aimed at preserving the Soviet Union. He saw himself as a Leninist figure. He grew up in that generation that was shocked by the crimes of Stalin. He had relatives who'd been affected by the repressive policies of the Stalin years. I seem to remember him talking about one of his grandfathers who had been, in fact, condemned to death at one point, but for somehow escaped the execution, and in fact, I believe was even freed from jail. So he had some personal experience of that, and probably also growing up in an agricultural area of the country. He came from the south of Russia, and he spoke with a marked southern accent, which I think sometimes exposed him to ridicule among the guardians of Russian grammar and the best Russian pronunciation in Moscow and Leningrad in those days. But he was somebody through all that experience was a very different and unexpected figure when he came to power. But he had this idea that the Soviet Union fundamentally was a viable system, and he was going to introduce new elements that would revive it, would I suppose coax it out of a state of stagnation and deep stagnation in which it found itself. And if you remember, he came to power after the death of Brezhnev, and then there were two other leaders of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, his mentor Yuri Andropov, and it was widely felt that Gorbachev might even succeed him, but instead this aging figure of Konstantin Chernenko was put into power. And as one of my university lecturers, I remember him saying this in the mid 1980s, it took a triumph of Soviet medicine to get him to sit up straight in a chair, and it really did feel like that. And so Gorbachev came in as somebody, he was, how old was he? He was 53 years old. He had an air of confidence about him, youth, vigor, and seemingly vision.
I think being born in 1931 was a serious stroke of bad luck amid the purges under Stalin and the awful famine that beset that part of the Soviet Union in the 30s. He later obviously gained this reputation as a reformer. Do you think that it was his upbringing the reason for that sympathy towards reform and the antipathy to Stalinism, do you think?
Well, I think with all the great reformers, there are I suppose a multitude of factors that shape them and their motivation. Undoubtedly, I think seeing the effects of Stalinism, being a believer in the communist ideal as he saw embodied by Lenin, believing that the country had been misled, or the Soviet system had been abused by Stalin and his henchmen. Gorbachev had this, a profound conviction that socialism was a beneficial force for the human race, and that the Soviet system could be made to work efficiently. And if you look at his early years in power as leader, as Soviet leader, he was focused on raising efficiency. So this notion, people sort of forget that he started out with this idea of acceleration, of trying to get the Soviet system to function better. He sent people, sort of inspection teams around Soviet factories to try to improve the quality of goods. But the overall quality of goods was so bad that it actually led to shortages as these factories, I don't know what, either shut down or they had to then amend their production processes. And he was somebody who saw very clearly the deep problem of alcoholism in the Soviet Union. And so, Gorbachev's sort of dry law, as it was known, the Sukhoi Zakon, made him actually very unpopular at the outset of his rule. So it was only later, I think, when he saw that, in fact, you just couldn't speed up the Soviet system like that. You had to give people space to breathe, to think, to criticize openly, to criticize constructively, that is. And that's when he, moved to this sort of signature policy, which has given us the word in English, of glasnost.
Yes.
of this openness. In fact, which had a historical antecedent back in the 19th century. So it wasn't entirely a sort of Gorbachevian phenomenon, as I recall. And then we went from the openness, in fact, to the sort of restructuring of a system, which became an ever deeper project. And as it went deeper, it destabilized the Soviet system. And that's what Gorbachev didn't see coming. And I sometimes think that he's somebody who probably wasn't that familiar with the history of the country. And in fact, the principles on which it had been built, because he had this, almost sort of religious reverence for Lenin, without seeing that.
That's quite an interesting observation. Do you have any idea why he was like that?
I don't. It might have been something to do with his early education. I'm not sure that we know a great deal about the people who inspired him in his early years. And let's say that, this boy who came from an agricultural family, he didn't have any strong connections, family connections with the Communist Party, as far as I'm aware. I mean, he joined the party as a young man. I forget how old he was at the time. But he ended up being offered a place at Moscow State University, with access to a student hostel at 19, and he didn't have to sit any exams. So he obviously distinguished himself in some way.
If we just look at the point at which Gorbachev took over in 1985 and look at what the Soviet Union was like then, I think clearly there was a great deal of political stagnation and ossification from the Brezhnev era into what was termed the gerontocracy of Andropov and Chernenko, as you mentioned. And to some degree, I think that the folly of the war in Afghanistan can be seen in that light. But economically, the Soviet Union, its economic performance had certainly slowed down in the 70s and early 80s, but it wasn't dreadful either. The economy wasn't sort of falling through the floor. There was still a relative degree of growth in the system. It was just slower. Do you think that in some ways we've sort of ended up looking back at that era in the knowledge that obviously the Soviet Union fell apart, but actually in a sense it was a relatively stable system?
I mean, I think you possibly put a slightly optimistic or positive gloss on the achievements of the Soviet system in its latter years. It was in trouble, and it had become very dependent on foreign imports from the West. It was having to export oil and gas to pay its way. It was falling behind in the arms race, and that was a critical factor. Just as microprocessors started to sort of enter the market in the 1980s, the Soviet Union was just way behind the curve. I remember this statistic when I started out as an analyst in the late 1980s, that at the time that there were 25 million computers already in the United States at the probably around the sort of mid 80s, around 1986, 7. In the Soviet Union there were 250,000. It was a gap that was that big, and it was starting to drive development of Western business, new Western technologies coming on board, and of course that in military affairs was starting to have real consequences, and the Soviet military were becoming worried because they knew their weapon systems were falling behind. So I think there were a sort of multitude of pressures on the system at that time, and Gorbachev and some of those around him understood, I think, how deep this malaise was, and that society was not particularly motivated to work and to achieve high results. And you think back to the Andropov days of going around cinemas during the day to make sure that people weren't skiving from work, and all these sort of efforts to reintroduce some discipline. It was a sense that society was degenerating, and quite rapidly. So I think the stagnation was really quite deep, and was possibly becoming, in the eyes of those who'd come to power, was becoming irreversible if they didn't take rapid action.
If you look at glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, they're seen now as two sides of the same coin. They're always quoted alongside one another, or virtually always quoted alongside one another. Was it possible only to have one of those two things, do you think? Or are they basically an extension of the same thing? Were they inseparable at the time?
I think they became inseparable. Certainly, the Gorbachevian thinking was that if you gave society greater freedom, people would become more productive as members of society. The fact that you would have debate would lead to better decisions. People would be better informed about what government policy was, for example. The legitimacy of the system would be increased. And, there's this sort of eroding belief in the achievements and the potential of the Soviet system would be arrested. You may be familiar with this idea, saying the Soviet Union, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. It was I think that was really quite deeply rooted. And for the Soviet system to succeed, it needed some sort of qualitative push to get it to the next level. So first of all, you open up the system a bit. And in fact, Gorbachev did that with I would say, considerable boldness. And he himself in his latter years, said that he might have been a bit too self-confident, because as soon as he allowed that to happen, these constituent republics of the Soviet Union, in several cases, but starting with the Baltic states and spreading elsewhere, they became much more conscious of themselves as nations. And these forces were then unleashed in the Soviet system, which proved to be unmanageable. So, but alongside that, you couldn't just sort of open up the debate and have freer media, and some very free media did appear. You had to take some of these bigger sort of structural decisions that began in a small way under Gorbachev in the economy with these cooperatives. So private business was essentially being legitimized at a low level, and then I suppose it went further into this whole question of competition in politics, and got to the point where it became legitimate to challenge the leading role of the party, and that's what probably most people couldn't have seen coming at the time. But Gorbachev seemed to have this very strong belief that the Communist Party would always win because it had the better ideas and a better model of development for the what we can now call in retrospect Soviet society. So he was a true believer, and I think he remained so until his dying day.
The conventional view of glasnost and perestroika is that, and you've alluded to this, is that sort of allowing people to criticize the system a bit, and I think the operative part of what you just said is a bit, and encouraging some reform, sort of opened the floodgates, really, and that Gorbachev basically lost control of the orchestra, that reform sort of overwhelmed the system and him in the end. Is that your view, or do you think that's oversimplifying?
No, I think that's a fair summary, that he unleashed forces that he thought initially would be beneficial to his cause and would lead to this sort of re-legitimizing of the Soviet ideals, would bring society behind them, would shake up the bureaucracy, put an end to many of the egregious inefficiencies of the economy. And the Soviet Union would take that qualitative leap forward. And he was probably inspired in some ways by the new economic policy under Lenin in the 1920s, when after the rigors of war communism, the new Bolshevik system had to give some ground because the country was exhausted, and it didn't look as though it would be able to sort of get back on its feet again. So I think he was probably inspired by some of those things, but At the end of the day, events accelerated, and he and the people at the top of the system just couldn't keep control. And as that, I suppose, crisis deepened, of course, he then started to see the splits within the system, because it wasn't, the sort of monolith that we imagine it to be. There were different constituencies that Gorbachev was having to manage, and his policies were extremely radical. I certainly remember as an analyst looking at some of the issues around security and defence, for example. Things the way he began talking to the West, the logical conclusion of that as reform in the Soviet Union ran in some cases far ahead of what certain countries in what we now thinking about the terminology at the time referred to as the Eastern Bloc, Warsaw Pact countries. And let's take East Germany, for example, or Romania. The very conservative, cautious regimes. The Soviet Union was starting to look like a liberal paradise compared to those countries. So it was starting to destabilize the hold of the Soviet Union on Eastern Europe. And these have been the great gains at the end for all the sacrifice of World War II. So, the prestige project was sort of being undermined.
This is something I wanted to ask you about next, is that this kind of controlled liberalization at home in part led to Gorbachev's decision to withdraw troops from much of Eastern Europe in 1987. Obviously, you've just mentioned it, but what's important to remember about the Eastern Bloc is that you had the satellite states, Poland, Hungary, East Germany, which weren't formally part of the Soviet Union, but were aligned to it. But also that the Soviet Union was a multi-ethnic republic. It wasn't just Russia. There were many different republics within that, Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, the Baltic states. Do you think that once Gorbachev removed the troops from the satellite states in Eastern Europe, from that point on, did disintegration within the Soviet Union become more or less inevitable?
Yes, I think so. It was clear that a historical process had begun. Gorbachev believed that he could cede space for time, in a sense. So he didn't want the Soviet Union burdened by these responsibilities in Central Europe, which were also through the heavy military presence of the Soviet Union, were contributing to these very great pressures on the country because of the investment in the arms race. You had 19 tank heavy divisions forward deployed in East Germany, and then NATO's layered cake defense on the other side in West Germany. So we were kind of head to head, and he was, I think, very smart in realizing that he could take the sting out of this by starting to reduce his forces, these disarmament initiatives, the dialogue he then established possibly against all the odds with Ronald Reagan. So, reduction of the strategic nuclear arsenal, intermediate nuclear weapons, that he could also change the West itself. And one of his top advisors said very famously at the time, he gave this sort of warning to the West: we're going to do something terrible to you. We're going to deprive you of an enemy. And there was something very profound in those words, because we then entered this period, which accelerated after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where we didn't think of Russia as being an enemy, and we effectively, disarmed. Yes, we kept NATO, but NATO was a very different animal for what it had been during the Cold War years.
I wanted to come on and ask you later about the kind of unipolar moment and whether it's actually turned out to be a very good thing. And I still will ask you about it later, but that's an amazingly prescient statement from one of his advisors. I'd never heard that before.
Yeah. Georgy Arbatov was his name. And it's always, stayed with me, that it was a very just intelligent understanding of the way the West worked.
The starting point for the question I asked you a second ago obviously comes with the benefit of hindsight that we now know that the Soviet republics did leave, starting in 1989. And what preceded that was the fall of the Berlin Wall and the freedom of Eastern Europe. When you look at the kind of bloodshed that has plagued the former Soviet Union since the fall of that union in 1991, in Georgia, in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Central Asia, and most obviously and awfully of all in Ukraine, which we're all living with now, do you ever feel a sense of regret that the dissolution happened?
I don't think of it in those terms. I just think it was historically inevitable, because the Soviet Union could have carried on, I suspect, for a good while, but it was never, I think, long-term going to be able to survive. It wasn't going to go on for another 70 years, because it was simply, the system was unable to compete. It was too unwieldy, and it couldn't be reformed. And that's possibly the tragedy of Gorbachev, his fundamental belief that you could reform this system. But at the end of the day, when you started to try to move it in another direction, you weakened it, and it lost its legitimacy. So it certainly, in let's say 1988, did not appear inevitable that Ukraine, for example, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, would within 3 years declare independence. And it was the old communist elites there that recognized that the only way to survive was to, in fact, play the nationalist card. And they did that very successfully, and this was replicated all over the Soviet Union. But let's say there were some republics that was extremely reluctant to embrace independence. And one of those is Kazakhstan, for example, right to the end. The Soviet Kazakh leader, who only recently, in fact, left power, Nursultan Nazarbayev, was one of those, lobbying for the preservation of the Soviet Union. But, interestingly also, and people tend to forget this, and particularly Russians who claim that the West is to blame for everything, is you think of the George Bush so-called Chicken Kiev speech in 1991. Almost imploring the Ukrainians to stay with Gorbachev and to, fulfill the terms of a new Union treaty, because the United States, and it wasn't alone here, was concerned about what will the breakup of the Soviet Union mean, and particularly in security terms, when you looked at the location of the strategic nuclear arsenal and large elements of it in both Ukraine and Kazakhstan. But I do think it was inevitable. Empires come to an end. This was the collapse of the last great European, transnational empire. And what we're experiencing today with the war in Ukraine is, in fact, I think, the final phase of that breakup. And we probably, almost certainly in 1991 and the immediate years after the collapse, we were very lucky that it was not more violent. In fact, it was remarkably peaceful in historical terms.
But it has not really turned out to be remarkably peaceful.
No, because we've I suppose we've come to the sort of real deal now, which is for years Ukraine, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was able to live in this kind of strategic ambivalence in its relations with Russia and the West, and as long as Russia got on with the West to a certain degree, Ukraine could sort of balance in between. But as soon as this alienation took place between Russia and the West, Russia and Europe in particular, then Ukraine found itself unbalanced, and it had to start to make choices. And we're seeing the outcome of the choices that the Ukrainians made.
I think also, of all of the republics, Ukraine was by far the most important one, strategically and economically, for the centre.
Most definitely, yes.
This leads us quite nicely to the differing perceptions of Gorbachev. The Soviet Union, as we've both said, fell in 1991, and Yeltsin became the first president of Russia. In the West, Gorbachev became a figure of massive respect. He's seen as the person who ended the Cold War. That's not his legacy in Russia.
Well, he's certainly seen as the person who ended the Cold War, but who destroyed the Soviet Union in the process. And that's led to him being demonized, and this very sort of low key. It seemed to me funeral of Putin staying away. The fact they hadn't allegedly spoken properly since 2006. Certainly, the people running Russia today have nothing but contempt for Gorbachev and his associates, who, as they see it, betrayed the national interest, didn't have the courage to save the country, and pursued all the wrong policies. So there is, I think, still a bit of debate to take place in Russia about, now the Russians have experienced the reverse. They've gone back to something like Soviet Union plus, with elements of fascism added to it. The days of Gorbachev and the sense of intoxicating freedom in the late 1980s, that still, I think, resonates with part of Russian society, that they really did live through a moment where Gorbachev gave them freedom. And I think future generations will conclude that Russians didn't use that freedom at the time. They didn't take sufficient action to institutionalize it, partly because they were totally unprepared for it, and also there wasn't, the I suppose the sort of history to turn to where you could, find, as you did in Poland or elsewhere in Central Europe, you could find, there were models of institutions that they could reactivate. It just wasn't there in Russia. Unless you went back, I don't know, maybe 600 or 700 years, to some of the, I suppose Russia didn't even exist at that time. It was, Muscovy and some of the other provinces, and Novgorod and places like that had some, some embryonic democratic institutions, but never developed beyond that. So, Russia was a very tough starting place. And historians might be a little less harsh, when they look back and say, well, you just have to go through these things, and maybe this time, having experienced Putinism or the horrors of it, a ghastly, devastating war of Ukraine that has damaged relations with probably Russia's closest ally for decades, people will conclude, well, the Russians did learn from that, and finally they did get on the right track. But that's speaking 50 or 60 years prematurely.
Did Gorbachev occupy any space in sort of Russian civil society in the sort of last two decades of his life under Putin?
Well, I think among the human rights groups, for example, he was somebody who's a deeply respected figure. Particularly those, one of the most prominent groups and most important in my view, Memorial, the group that researched into the horrors of Stalin's crimes, and tried to, I think, introduce into Russian consciousness an understanding of what had taken place and how deeply Russia itself had been damaged by those things. So I think those people in large measure owe their success in undertaking that research to the vision of somebody like Gorbachev, who knew that this discussion had to take place.
If you think about the nature of the regime that's replaced the Soviet Union in the long run, it's defined by Orthodox Christianity and a hard right extreme nationalism. I'm just going to read a passage from a book I started reading this week. It's called Black Hundred by Walter Lecoeur, and it deals with the rise of the far right in Russia. It's quite a long passage, but considering it's written 30 years ago, it's proven immensely perceptive, so I just want to read it. The breakdown of Soviet communism caused an ideological as well as political void, and nature abhors a vacuum in Russia even more than elsewhere. Some saw the breakdown of the dictatorship as the great opportunity for the return of freedom to Russia, part of a worldwide trend toward democratic institutions. But the odds were heavily stacked against it. Democratic institutions have not been deeply rooted in Russian history. Furthermore, the breakdown of Soviet rule was bound to result in severe crises, economic, political and social. Thus, the right-wing nationalist forces had a good chance in the struggle both for the soul of Russia and for its political future. The Russians took socialism, a political doctrine that led to social democracy and the welfare state, and turned it into a nightmare. There is the danger that nationalism and explosive forces at the best of times might fare similarly, fueled by hatred and selfishness and pursued at the expense of all other values, and become yet another monster. What I've read is basically a perfect description of what's happened in the last 30 years with the rise of Putin and this nightmarish kind of irredentist war. Given the way in which the Soviet Union fell, should we be at all surprised by what's happened since 1991?
I think we might be surprised at the speed at which it's happened. And I think back to the 1990s when Russia went through this wrenching change that people in the West find hard to understand because it affected people's lives so profoundly. One day you were living in this country called the Soviet Union, and the next day, it had gone. But not just that, the system that you had become accustomed to, in which you felt a degree of security, was swept away from under your feet. The Soviet economy disappeared, almost overnight. And this, I suppose initially very primitive form of market relations or market economy appeared. And, you might have had a relatively safe job and you suddenly discovered you were no longer being paid a salary. The health service was collapsing. You were, seriously short of money. And, possibly the only way of making money was to start becoming a market trader. I mean, that was what it was like for a large chunk of Russian society. These were brutal times because the system collapsed. Now, remarkably, within 10 years, Russia was starting to get back on its feet again. And Putin and his close associates got extraordinarily lucky because they came to power just as a commodity boom was starting. So, during the Yeltsin years, if oil had been at $50 rather than $60 rather than 10 or 15, the outcome might have been a bit different. But the die was effectively cast, I think, in the early 90s. And the critical event was the 1993 shelling of the White House, of the parliament in Moscow. And Yeltsin's establishment, under a new constitution, of a super presidency that simply, perpetuated many of the ills of Tsarist Russia. It's just excessive concentration of power. And then, as Russia became wealthier, you had this really toxic combination of the fusion of business and power, but with the securocrats, these so-called siloviki, the people with KGB backgrounds, who felt they'd been excluded in the 90s, and it was actually time to get their fingers into the big pie, and they were able to consolidate their positions. And Russian society went along with this because it too was benefiting from the trickle-down effect. Most boats did rise over the last, up to 2014, the Russian economy was still growing, hasn't grown really since then. And you could say in historical terms that Russians had never lived so well. So I think it was this sort of combination of forces that has cemented in place a system that is heavily criminalized, with a group of people who, at the top, who have become fabulously wealthy and who have a very good idea of how to hold on to power. And so they've known how to shrink the space for civil society, to roll back those freedoms that were gained under Gorbachev. And Russian society simply didn't react. And this is the big difference between Russia and, in my view, Ukraine. Ukraine, over that same period, developed a much stronger awareness in civil society of the need to defend its rights. And we saw that in the 2004 revolution, the Orange Revolution, and then again in the Revolution of Dignity 10 years later. And of course, these differences between the two, we referred earlier in the conversation to the fact that Ukraine was so important as a constituent part of the Soviet Union, therefore important to Russia. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia never, I don't think the people in Moscow ever believed that Ukraine would become genuinely independent and move away from the Russian embrace. And so when that started to happen, it radicalized thinking in Moscow. And this notion that Russia was under attack, it put itself under attack by in fact making itself very unattractive to those around them, and particularly Ukraine. So we've returned to this sort of notion of the besieged fortress in Russia, and you can see certain parallels with the Soviet Union, the sort of paranoid thinking that they could be about to enter an existential crisis, if they cede a bit of territory, or if, in this case, they accept that Ukraine is truly independent and it should be allowed to go its own way. That this is somehow damaging to Russia because, as Putin and co see it, it's the incarnation of an anti-Russia. Because, as they see it, the West has poisoned the minds of Ukrainians and encouraged them to speak Ukrainian and not Russian, and to gravitate away from this cultural pull of Russia, that Russia itself is in crisis.
If you think about the Chinese Communist Party, since the end of the 1970s, they've morphed into something that few would say is genuinely Marxist in its economic program and analysis, but has certainly become overall more nationalist. And they've survived. They've now survived for around as long as the Bolsheviks were in power in Russia. If the Soviet Union had survived longer than it did, let's say Gorbachev had never come to power and the kind of Brezhnevite gerontocracy style of leadership had just carried on, do you think it actually would have morphed into something that looks fairly similar to Putin's regime anyway?
Very hard to say. Certainly, it would have sooner or later faced, I think, some existential choices. Could it have carried on just on this sort of slow trajectory, sunk into greater decline? Almost certainly. Would that have made it Russian nationalist? Would it have made it aggressive towards perhaps those parts of the country that would have wanted to leave or felt that there was no future? Quite possibly. So we might have ended up, in a similar place, but I think it would have taken much longer. Perhaps it wouldn't have been so violent. Possibly the Soviet system that had been on life support for that bit longer simply wouldn't have had the strength to try to fight back, the way the Russians have been doing in recent years. Fighting back, I think, with overall they see themselves in this sort of epic struggle with the United States over who has the greater say in international affairs. They want it together, with the Chinese and others, cut back Western influence and simply ensure they can benefit from that. Probably also just sort of legitimizing their political thinking. They've been constantly attacking the Western culture and the principles of democracy. So if they had been able to perhaps decline more slowly, I don't think they would have necessarily had the conviction behind them that they did offer an alternative model to the world, as perhaps the Soviet Union had in the 50s or indeed 60s, when it was advancing the anti-colonization agenda in Africa and Asia, those parts of the world. So it would have been a different picture, but we certainly could have ended up with a extremely resentful, isolationist power that became unpredictable, did some nasty things to some of its peoples, and we wouldn't have been in a particularly happy position. What would have happened to something like the Warsaw Pact? I think that would have crumbled. I don't think the hold on Eastern Europe was viable for that much longer. We now know a lot more than we did at the time about the state of some of those regimes, particularly the East German regime. They were living on borrowed time, and it seems that the Russians didn't actually even themselves have the full picture of how indebted East Germany had become. So you probably would have seen those countries, perhaps on a slower trajectory, rejoin the West as they saw it, and that would have posed a whole series of problems for an ailing Soviet leadership. And who knows, we might have ended up in some form of really unpleasant confrontation, military confrontation, as a result of that. The fact that we were able to get Soviet troops out of Central Europe in the mid-90s at great speed, and it has to be said that the Russians put great effort into this, and the retreat from East Germany was achieved ahead of schedule. And certainly Chancellor Kohl, the West German leader at the time, didn't believe that that was going to come about, and probably would have given the Russians more time to do it. So we got lucky.
I think what you've been describing is the difference between those two scenarios, the hypothetical one and what actually happened, is just a difference of speed with which the system fell apart. There is a body of thought in both Russia and in the West that says that in the 1990s, the West kind of kicked the enemy when they were down, with a sort of 1-2 punch of imposing a very unrealistic form of capitalism on countries like Russia, and also by moving into Russia's sphere of influence, what it calls its near abroad. Do you think any of that's valid?
The short answer is no. I think they certainly were very harsh times for Russia in the 1990s. They received some bad economic advice, I'm quite sure. But there was a political purpose to what they were doing through this dash for the market and these extraordinary privatizations that then, of course, corrupted the country to a large degree. But they were, designed to see off a resurgence of the communists, and a belief among those who'd taken power in Moscow there was a danger that the communists would come back. So it was a question of just breaking their influence. And, some would say that was actually a very Leninist approach. you have to take the most radical measures to defeat your political enemies, and they may have very far-reaching economic consequences, but you just have to swallow that because the alternative is worse. So you could make that argument. I don't think that was the purpose of some of the Western advice that was given, but that's certainly how it was interpreted by some. And the key figure in those privatizations at the time, the figure of Anatoly Chubais, who became deeply unpopular and controversial as a result. I mean, as far as the security issue goes, and I'm I suppose well acquainted with that from my days as a NATO official based in Moscow in the 1990s, and I've been around the argument of NATO enlargement many times, and listened to lots of forthright views on that, both from people in Russia and in the West itself, who are critical of the way it happened. But again, I think it was to some extent inevitable, because let's face it, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, the first countries to join NATO, then followed by the Baltic states and others, they did have profound security concerns about Russia, and this was in their DNA. And Russia at that point was, it simply was not either unwilling or unable to give them the type of reassurance that they sought. So you could say, in fact, there was something on offer to Russia in the 1990s from NATO, and that was the opportunity, in fact, to build relations between the two, between NATO and Russia, and do the classic NATO thing, which is to operate more together, to get to know each other better through cooperation, and to build the trust that goes with it. And that's what NATO countries were very successful at doing in relations between themselves. And that's really the reason why the alliance stayed together at the end of the Cold War, because the member states found those mechanisms valuable for managing relationships between themselves. And that's, I think, to many of those outside NATO, that's just not understood, and the organization hasn't always explained it particularly well. But that opportunity was on offer, but Russia spurned it. And for various reasons. The military didn't want to play. There was too much distrust. The military system was, of course, in disarray in the 1990s. I think there was a lack of people on the Western side who were really able to, lead that sort of activity that would have helped build trust. But the little flashes I saw of where NATO and NATO countries were able to cooperate with Russia were extremely positive. There was lots of potential there. Military people get on together pretty well. They have a common language. They're curious about each other. And if we had perhaps been able to deepen some of the embryonic cooperation we had, for example, there was a Russian brigade integrated into a NATO-led peacekeeping operation in Bosnia-Herzegovina after the signing of the Dayton Peace Accords. I think that was a very positive experience for both sides. But the problem was the Russians who participated, particularly in the command structure, because it was complicated command structure that ensured that, in practical terms, that to all intents and purposes, the Russian force was under Russian command. But that there had to be, of course, that Russian command had to be integrated into the NATO command to make it all work. But the people who served at the alliance headquarters in Europe, for example, on the Russian side, they went back to Moscow after finishing and discovered that their careers were over. Effectively, I think they'd been seen to collaborate with the enemy. And so we just didn't have enough time to deepen what would have been probably a natural process, of finding a common language and working together, because the Poles and others were quite understandably knocking on the door saying, well, what's going to happen to us? We don't want to be left in a grey zone in Central Europe. And they were absolutely right to make that point, because a grey zone would have been destabilizing. So it's one of those things where you just can't quite win. We were just, I think, unlucky with the way a situation formed that led to the Russians feeling resentful and immediately triggering, I think, some of their sort of classic reactions in that situation, where they, felt they had a reason to distrust the West, dislike the West, and see it as a source of threat. But they had a tendency, and still have a tendency, in my view, and I say this after many years of interacting with them, to nurse grievances. And that sometimes, it's sort of easier to blame others than to blame yourself for the failings of your system. And unfortunately, we got into that spiral a little bit too early.
I think the theme of mistrust and paranoia has kept coming up today, and it's going to carry on coming up with Putin. I mean, I think it's always worth probably pointing out that spheres of influence can and do overlap, right? And the NATO's presence in Europe made it inevitable that countries like Poland and Hungary and the Baltic states were part of our sphere of influence as well as in Russia's.
Well, I don't think we wanted to see it that way. At the end of the day, there was a choice on offer. If Russia had developed its democratic institutions, if it had reformed its security culture, if it had decided to truly respect the independence of the countries around it, then I think it would have contributed to creating a very different security environment. And there would have been fewer differences between us. So the notion of a sort of separate sphere of influence would have had less validity. And in fact, the Russians would have probably had I would say, a greater degree of influence in Brussels, for example, and particularly in NATO. If they decided to play ball and be really cooperative, many NATO member states would have been falling over themselves to deepen that cooperation. And perhaps the enlargement of NATO wouldn't have gone as fast as it did. But these are sort of all hypothetical points that historians will no doubt debate in much more detail as we move forward. But the trouble is that when decisions come onto, or when initiatives sort of come onto the agenda, politicians have to sometimes take decisions rapidly and without a full understanding of what their consequences might be. It's guesswork. But at the end of the day, I think we can say the Poles and the Balts called it right. They told us incessantly the Russians will not change. They have not changed. And because they haven't changed, we're going to have a problem in Europe. So we want to be inside, the secure space. So please let us in. And those warnings were ignored by many. The Balts were told they were being, too emotional because of their history. The Germans were inclined to tell them, no, it's not like that. We know them better than you do. We have better access to them. It's time to calm down. And we Germans will buy more gas from them, and that will sort of keep the Russians calm. But of course, the situation turned out to be very, very different.
What did Gorbachev have to say about that idea of? Was he a proponent of the idea that the West had sort of let the Russians down in the 90s?
He certainly, when it came to the NATO issue, for example, tried to argue that, not very convincingly in my view, that Russia had been badly treated, or the Soviet Union, the assurances the Soviet Union received were then not fulfilled. And he pointed the finger of blame at the West, I think, for not being sympathetic towards Russia, or sufficiently sympathetic, and trying to exploit its weakness, particularly during the 1990s. But at the same time, he was critical of things that Yeltsin, well, of course, Yeltsin was his arch rival, so he was never going to be generous about him, but particularly Putin had done. And by the time he died, he could see very clearly the turn that Russia had taken after Putin had come to power, which had simply wiped out the achievements which he thought that he'd brought to Russians. But of course, the irony is that he's somebody who, in fact, didn't speak out against the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And as I recall, appeared to welcome it. I think he was even sanctioned by the Ukrainians later for his apparent support for the annexation. And of course, for him, there was this personal connection with Crimea, because that's where he was deposed from power in the attempted coup in 1991.
You spoke earlier about the Soviets recognizing that their withdrawal from Eastern Europe, in a sense, deprived the Western Security Alliance of an enemy. In your eyes, what were the biggest disadvantages of that from the American point of view? I mean, in the long run, the most glaring one was the fabrication of enemies that were much harder to contain or even define than the Soviet Union, like Islamist terrorism, which is much more diffuse, geographically not a unit, unlike the Soviet Union. What were the big problems the US faced in the so-called unipolar moment?
Well, let's go back a second. I think the person who made this famous statement, Georgy Arbatov, that the Soviet Union was going to deprive the West of an enemy, he did not have in mind at the time that the Soviet Union was going to collapse, that the Warsaw Pact would be dissolved, and European security arrangements would be largely reconfigured. He said that at a point when the Soviet Union was looking to create time and space for reforms at home, and when it wanted to slow down the arms race. But of course, in retrospect, those people inadvertently did something totally unexpected for the West, which was that they accelerated, in my view, the inevitable demise of the Soviet Union, and as a result left the United States in what you described correctly as this sort of unipolar moment when Russia certainly existed on the political map, but was going through such an intense phase of internal reform and indeed dislocation at the time in the 90s that it was not, a serious security player, beyond the fact, of course, that it had a strategic nuclear arsenal. And the Americans had been very sure to take the action to remove those parts of the strategic nuclear arsenal, the Soviet strategic nuclear arsenal, that were beyond the borders of Russia when the Soviet Union collapsed, so in Kazakhstan and Ukraine. So that was, from their perspective, extremely, extremely important. So at that stage, in the early 90s, there was still this sense of idealism about the way in which the European continent would evolve. It would be a peaceful order stretching from Vancouver to Vladivostok in the Russian Far East. And I don't think there was so much focus initially on what this would mean for global stability more broadly, because there was a sense that if Russia was a cooperative player, there were so many problems you were going to be able to resolve in the world, not realizing, of course, that then certain other forces were unleashed. And we'd moved, I guess, looking back, we'd moved beyond Saddam Hussein's incursion into Kuwait, but Iraq clearly remained a serious challenge for US security policy. China was not yet on the rise in the way it was a decade later. So the United States could probably sort of sit back for a moment and think, well, we effectively won the Cold War. We have the Washington Consensus, and we may have some peaceful and very profitable decades ahead of us, while those new countries that emerged from the Soviet Union were, in theory, democratizing. This victory in the Cold War was highly significant and appeared to demonstrate that the Western model was obviously much stronger than, economically and politically stronger than the Soviet-inspired alternative. And this would, I think, looking back on it, must have inspired US security policymakers to believe that also those parts of the world that had in fact been loyal to the Soviet Union or benefited from the Soviet Union would also have to come around to the fact that, in fact, the Soviet Union had emerged as the loser in the Cold War, and those countries were no longer going to benefit from the same sort of largesse, and probably their political systems and economic systems would have to shift in a similar direction.
John, that's been a very interesting talk. Thank you very much. If people want to read more of the stuff that you write about Russia or about other security issues, where can you direct them to?
Well, I can direct them to my recently published book. It's just come out in a second edition in recent weeks, which is Germany's Russia Problem. It was published initially in July 21, and it's now come out with an update to reflect the changed situation with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Otherwise, my writing is mainly to be found on the Chatham House website. I've been an associate fellow of the Institute since 2009. And I've taken a fairly sort of broad interest in the region, and written about Ukraine, Belarus, Central Asia to some extent. But my interest has always been in the way that Russia thinks about its relations with Europe and what drives that thinking, and particularly the security thinking.
Thank you, John.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and, for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, so you never miss new content.